Yeah, well, I think we're both delighted to be here with colleagues from Ireland. As Helen says, it's lovely to be in Europe, even if it is just virtually. But hopefully what we're going to share with you today will, I think, resonate with the experiences that you've had in Ireland. And we're going to talk about work that we've done and we're continuing to do with JISC. And before we start, just want to give a big shout out to Sarah Knight at JISC, who has really championed this work and is really involved and has been instrumental and an integral part of what we're doing. I think Sarah has done a tremendous job in supporting the sector and keeping learning and teaching at the forefront of what JISC are doing. So yeah, Sarah can't be with us today, but just wanted to acknowledge her role in this, the survey work and the review that we did last year, and also our continuing work. So what we want to do is really kind of, there's going to be two halves. I'm going to share a bit of the review that we did about approaches to curriculum learning and learning design, which we completed last year. And I'll take you through that, and then we'll move on from the recommendations from that to the work that we're doing just now, which Helen is going to take you through there. And this is work that is emerging, so we'll be really interested to get your feedback on our thoughts and where we're going with it. So yeah, hopefully it'll be quite a nice interactive session for everyone as well and be useful. So just a quick recap of the review that we did. So last spring, so April, May, Helen and I were commissioned to undertake a review of approaches to UK curriculum and learning design across the UK higher education sector. And we were really interested to find out what, if any, impact the pandemic experience had and was continuing to have on approaches to curriculum design, to staff development and learning and teaching in general. And was it really changing how people were thinking about how they were delivering learning and teaching in flexible and accessible ways? So we did a desk review, which Helen led on, looking at reports and studies relatively, recent over the past 2 years. We did a survey, a self-selecting open survey, and then I conducted a number of interviews with people that across the sector who were involved in this. The outputs of that were a survey report, summary of the models in use across the sector, and some recommendations to JISC and curriculum providers across the sector. And I've put a link in there where you can access the report. We also did a podcast, I think last September, which was Sarah, Helen and I. And actually, that's quite a good thing to listen to. I think that gives you a slightly, maybe a slightly more nuanced overview of some of the findings of the survey and the desk review as well. So although I hate listening to my own voice, it's actually quite a nice podcast to listen to if you're interested in that. So that's basically what we did. So I'm just going to take you through some of the key findings now from that work. So we had responses from 75 higher education providers across the UK. It was, as I said, it was a self-selecting survey. So we just basically hit all the email lists with the link to the survey. We had 155 individual responses. 16 discipline areas were identified within that, and we had just over 1,300 free text comments. So quite a nice data set that we had to work with. In terms of the breakdown here across the UK, you can see England, we did have more responses from English institutions, but that's not surprising because there are more there as well. But we had responses from Scotland, from Wales and from Northern Ireland. And that table there just shows you the breakdown of the subject areas. So it was mainly education and teaching, and a lot of people didn't want to identify their discipline either. But there was quite a nice spread across social sciences, and medicine as well, in the ones, the people that did choose to select and share their discipline with us. One of the things we wanted to find out was where support for curriculum and learning design was provided in institutions. And it was quite interesting to see the split there between central academic development units and departments, or central digital and e-learning units, and department and school units as well. So a lot of people who had both were saying that they used them. So definitely there is a role for that a central unit, as well as more specialised school and faculty units. Library IT were also mentioned there, and there were a few other places that people went to for support, and they were sometimes external agencies like Advance HE, JISC, and ILTA, and those kind of places as well. But it was mainly kind of that nice split between departmental specialised provision and centrally supported units. One of the things we wanted to look at in the survey and in the desk review was to look at the models that people were using and what kind of structures were in place. So just over half of the respondents said that they did have an institutional model or approach or some kind of structured methodology that they used. Very high percentage of the respondents, 78%, said that there was a project team or some kind of initiative that supported learning design. And when we asked in free text, what were the models that they were using, quite a wide range were mentioned, but the ABC model was the one that got 40%. It got the highest mention. But actually, when we looked at the free text comments, it's actually what people are doing. They're kind of contextualizing a mix of models. So they're taking bits of ABC, bits of maybe Carpe Diem, and they're contextualizing them for their institutional needs. So there is quite clear that there's quite an experienced group of professionals that are working in this area that can do this and can do this well within their own context in their universities. Oh, sorry. And that kind of chimed with the desk review as well. There were very similar models that were coming through there. And you can see, if you download the report, you can get more detail about the commonalities and within these models. And principles were coming through. A lot of people are using principles now as kind of strategic tools to think about learning design as well. So you can see there, constructive alignment and Bloom's did come through very strongly in the survey as well. I don't think there may be a model, but they're certainly very important as people are supporting designing for learning across institutions as well. And I think particularly in terms of constructive alignment, it's not just kind of a traditional big constructive alignment. I think people are looking at constructively aligning with their strategic principles as well. But the principles that are being developed are very kind of context and institutionally specific as well. And yeah, you can see if you go into the report, you can have a look at them in more detail. We did ask about the impact of the pandemic, and I think it's quite useful to look back at that, because I think now we all kind of think that it's over, but it's not, as we all know. Certainly in the UK, the figures in December for COVID were, I think, the highest that they had ever been, and people are still recovering from that. So so here are some of the highlights that we had. So definitely over the pandemic period, I think this is probably the same in Ireland as well, there were more specialist staff that were employed. There were some, there were more learning technologists, more instructional designers, learning designers. There were some changes to units and departments, some of them brought on by the pandemic, some of them more in that kind of natural cycle of development anyway. One thing I think that, again, we shouldn't forget is that the pandemic did create, this general upskilling of staff digital capabilities. Everyone had to interact with technologies in ways that they had possibly been able to avoid previously. And that came through quite strongly in the survey. A lot of people in the interviews and within the survey said that they were actually updating, or they had updated some learning and teaching and assessment policies, in some of them in light of the pandemic experience, particularly around assessment. And some of them, it was more kind of the natural cycle of review of policies anyway, but they were trying to take that experience and use that within the development of new strategies. However, the flip side of that was, and I know this has been the same in Ireland as well, there was that political pressure from the government to get people back on campus, to do, air quotes, proper education in person, in the exam hall. So there was definitely a feeling that some of maybe the more forward-thinking strategy around flexible and more blended approaches was actually had to be pulled back because of government intervention, and then various other pragmatic inputs like visa requirements, people being on campus. But that definitely has had an impact on people's aspirations, if you like. The other thing that came through very clearly was that if you are having any kind of learning design or curriculum approach, then that does have more of an impact if you can align any changes or any implementation of that, introduction of that around some strategic changes, such as, if there's a curriculum review or refresh, then that's certainly how people get in to across the university as well. And what came through very strongly as well, there were, again, going back to what I was saying there about the COVID figures, there's just huge concern, as there always is, around student well-being and staff well-being. Our students have gone through, and staff have gone through, a really tumultuous time over the last couple of years. I don't think they've had a proper convalescence period. It's just been, people have been going on, and, people are still exhausted and tired, and the after effects of the pandemic are still rippling on. So lots to think of in terms of that. We did ask specifically what people thought the key areas to support curriculum learning design and change would be over the coming years. And probably no surprise there that staff workload allocation and investment in staff development came out really, really highly. They were the two top ones there. People realise, and I think again the pandemic experience made people realise how much work and different types of work that they had to do to develop more flexible learning materials. So if you want to continue to do that, they're worried about staff allocation and workload allocation to allow them to do that. There were also some other things in there as well, government policy models and processes, and you can see that there. We also asked what people thought were the main challenges to providing a good learning experience. And apologies, I've just realised I've got that heading in twice there. So that was quite interesting, because what came through there was flexible, accessible and equitable learning opportunities. So I think people have been really want to provide flexible learning opportunities. They're listening to what students are saying. They're thinking about the experience of the last couple of years, and they're thinking about how they can do that. Again, effective use of space, digital and physical, came out quite highly there, as did student well-being. Again, a real concern. Everyone's very concerned about their students. Effective use of digital technologies and supporting different modes of participation and assessment design. Plagiarism and academic integrity weren't mentioned as highly, but I don't think that's because people aren't interested in that. And obviously with ChatGPT just now, there's a huge debate about that going on in the sector. I think this just possibly because this survey was very much focused on a kind of a broader approaches to curriculum and learning design, and also just done quite a big piece on assessment anyway. So I think people had an opportunity to share their concerns around assessment there. Just in terms of the findings and recommendations before I hand over to Helen. So you can see the main findings there, probably not that surprising, but good to have the data to back that up. So learning and teaching strategies are the main drivers for curriculum design process, implementing it or developing it. There is, we could see that there was evidence of reviews and new interests in different modes of delivery. One of the surprising things for me that came out was that an awful lot of learning design materials are available as open educational resources. So I think learning design is kind of a route into not just open educational resources, but open educational practice. And I think a lot of people that are involved in supporting learning design are open educational practitioners. So there's a wealth of material that's openly available for people. So it's good to see that sharing happening and that sharing of practice. There's also very clear links between quality assurance and quality enhancement and staff engagement with learning design. So it's kind of the things that you have to do, whether that's internal quality assurance processes, or whether you're having to work with professional bodies, because obviously they both impact on how you develop your curriculum. A strategic approach does work best, and you can get that buy-in, and that helps everyone. But everyone is worried about staff workload allocation and the lack of reward structures for engaging with learning design. people really want to work with students, but it's quite difficult. Some institutions are doing some great work with students, but actually involving them in the design process is still quite challenging. And that's really probably because students are actually quite busy doing quite a lot of other things as well. So people want to do that, but I think that's an area that people definitely want to work with, work more on, but it's not quite there yet. So in terms of our recommendations, one of the things that came through was really thinking about workload models. And what Helen and I have been thinking about is kind of the whole kind of time, space, place, and modes of interaction. So how are you thinking about designing flexible, equitable, accessible learning activities now, to make sure that you can engage with students, because we know we have the problem with engagement, and people are saying, no, even though students are on campus, they're maybe not coming to lectures. So there's a whole piece of work that we're looking at just now. And following on from that, I think Helen and I both feel that we actually maybe need to develop more of a shared vocabulary to describe what's happening, because hybrid and high flex, we feel, are not quite cutting the mustard. They're maybe not getting into the nuance of what's actually happening across the sector, and there may be slightly more a technical deterministic view. So you buy a hybrid system and that's used to solve the problem, which we all know it's not quite as simple as that to do. So they're the main findings, and that's kind of guiding our work just now. So I'm going to hand over to Helen now to take you through one of the outcomes from the phase one was kind of this process model for learning design and how people are thinking about and implementing curriculum and learning design. So I'll just mute and I'll, well, do you want me just to keep sharing, Helen? And I can, yeah.
Is that okay with you, Sheila? It's probably a bit more seamless. That's great. Thank you. Thanks for such a great setup as well. So picking up from the first phase of work that Sheila's been talking about, this process model, I think I should emphasize it's very much a descriptive model, in the sense that this is a kind of broad and general account of what people on the whole are already doing in the space of curriculum and learning design. It's not a how you should do it. It's trying to come to an understanding that we can share of what's involved, of who's involved, of the decisions that are made, and how those decisions might be supported. So I seem to remember when I was first working in this space, and yeah, we're all feeling very ancient who've been doing this several times around. But the usual practice was for curriculum teams to have a lot longer than 90 minutes to run through a workshop that would consider some of these issues. But partly thanks to projects we have like ABC, and in Ireland you have some great resources on learning design. I think there's more of an expectation now that some of this work will happen in quite a quick sort of sprint process, and we thought it was worth unpacking what happens in that process. So at the left hand end of this model are some of the things coming into that process which you could see as information, like, you know, business cases. You could see as constraints, so there will be a lot of constraints in the UK around professional bodies and standards bodies, but they're certainly informing that process at a high level. And then in the kind of orangey yellow part in the middle is where the decision-making process that actually we're interested to try and support a bit better with vocabularies and perhaps materials, guidance. You know, people use little cards in that space, people use planning matrices. And what we really noticed, as Sheila was saying, is that universities in the UK are particularly coming up with their own principles, which are often, you know, great principles, and they're part of that university's brand quite often, in terms of this is what we offer students, this is our curriculum. But also there's not always a great connect between those high-level principles, great as they sound, which nowadays definitely include things like student well-being, and some of the immediate prompts and kind of constraints on decision making that happen in that space of allocating time, allocating space, allocating materials. And then on the right, we've kind of what comes out of that process, which is very much decisions around time and space was what we've really started to focus in on, as well as materials, as well as tools, as well as learning outcomes. So Sheila, if you go to the next slide, the process, of course, also ideally, as we've mentioned in terms of student engagement, goes in the other direction. So hopefully there's information coming out of the curriculum, how teaching has gone, the student experience. Also might be data-based around the kind of materials and platforms students actually access, despite what may have been designed for them. Experiences of staff and students, achievements, which come back through the process and inform it from the other end. And ideally, I guess, we would want those experiences of staff and students in the curriculum to be influencing at the level of the university's principles and practices and processes, and even the professional and regulatory bodies would be attending to that, as indeed the pressure of the pandemic seems to have created that pressure for some of that backflow from the experience at the front line to actually we really need to rethink what the modes of participation are going to be going forward, what the value is of being on campus, what the pressures are to be on campus or not to be on campus, and how that affects different students and their experiences of learning. So if we move on, Sheila, we've talked a bit about curriculum and learning design and the pandemic impact. One of the things that we felt, particularly talking to teaching staff as stakeholders, was that before the pandemic, a lot of the changes we see around technology were happening already. And learning design, certainly in the UK, had become a term that was being used. And what it had led to was things like typologies of learning outcomes that might be mapped to particular digital tools, for example. Support for digital media production, so recognizing that students were going to be accessing digital media as part of their curriculum, and that the curriculum design should think about that, should allocate resource to that. Thinking about what students were actually doing with their technology, what were those activities, how were those activities leading to learning? And, obviously we've had virtual learning environments for some time now. Thinking about virtual and learning environments becoming more than just a repository of stuff, and thinking about how they supported different activities, different kinds of engagement with tools and materials. What we found after the pandemic was there'd been a really material shift towards thinking more in terms of the whole experience of participating in the curriculum. So we'd had this kind of lift and shift from the campus-based experience to particularly on online experience. Online video came through, and that's led to a whole reappraisal really of what it is we're doing in the classroom when we're in the classroom with students, why students might come into lectures, surgeries, question and answer sessions, and why they might not, why they might choose not to. How do we redesign the whole of assessment around particularly thinking about new challenges around AI in learning, but just in general terms, which means redistributing time through the curriculum, because a lot of more authentic assessments require several bites at the cherry going through, and not just kind of one end game final assessment. So what we had noticed through this shift was that there was a real move to rethinking place, the place of the campus, what's its value for learning, other places and platforms that students might be engaging in, what are their particular values for learning, how do students experience those differently, because we know that different students do have greater or lesser comfort, greater or lesser focus in different spaces. But also, and I think it's not quite so obvious, there's been a rethinking of time and timetabling, not just what students are doing and when, and how technology can kind of open and close time for them. They can take a recorded lecture, they can listen to it in their own time, perhaps speed it up. They can take notes in one kind of synchronous mode, and then they can revisit those notes, perhaps on a Padlet, in their private time, and extend the time they have to engage with those notes. And of course, also thinking about teaching staff, because a lot of this requires more preparation. So it may be that the time that teaching staff are engaging with the curriculum and the attention and value they're bringing to it might be differently distributed. Have we got workload models that really recognize that? Well, I think we don't. And we can't fix that in a small JISC funded project. But what we can do is try to open up conversations about time and space in the curriculum, how they've changed, and how that creates new pressures and demands, and how organisationally we might respond to them. So Sheila, if we could move on to the next bit. So this is taking those green bits at the right hand end of our model, and just noticing that what comes out of the curriculum and learning design process is, in many ways, it's about allocating time and space, or pace and place, you could call it. So we need to think about what kind of synchronous and asynchronous session types are going to make different demands on staff student time and provide for different kinds of interaction. And this is, as Sheila was saying, where we get beyond these terms like blended and hybrid, and we start to ask more particular questions about particular times and session types and what they do for learning and what students invest in them and how they might invest in them. We also then find an allocation of space and place. So when are students engaging in platforms that we have allocated? When are they perhaps engaging in their own platforms that they've chosen to be in collaboratively or individually? When are we saying, no, you have to be on campus in this space, perhaps for a very good reason, because it has facilities and resources you don't get anywhere else. It's a laboratory. It's a seminar room where we can have particular kinds of group discussion that we can't easily replicate in another place. And what activities will go on there. And what we've called mode of participation is a combination of time and place considerations. What works for different activities, what works for different students, what is the pattern and sequence and flow of those, and particularly how are students going to integrate those and make choices about them? What agency do they have? So we can see that in the past, the curriculum would have been kind of integrated around a handbook, which would have a lot of this information in. But now we see students expecting to make more choices about when they come onto campus, what they engage with when they do, what platforms they're engaged in and when and how. And again, student well-being suggests we should give students as much choice as possible, but staff workload notices that the more choice students have about mode and time and place, actually the more difficult it can be for teaching staff to create an integrated experience for those students. So we'll move on quickly because we want to kind of give you lots of time for questions. So this is coming back to the point, I think, that we're trying to talk to academics and curriculum teams and institutions about, that calling something hybrid, buying something in that calls itself a hybrid piece of technology doesn't actually fix the problems about time and space that teaching staff and students have, and how best to manage them for their learning. We know that students can, in any given time or space of the curriculum, let's say a live lecture like we're having now, students can also be accessing other times and spaces through their devices. Hopefully we're interesting enough that you're not too scattered and distributed with your attention right now, but you could be. And if you had something that demanded your urgent attention, well, it's really useful that you can be. And students are having to then connect and collect learning across times and places and platforms and different kinds of media and different modes of participating. Their use of digital media can certainly compress and extend learning time. They can learn on the tram, they can watch a lecture at double speed, they can engage with an asynchronous environment we've set up for them whenever they choose to, in the middle of the night, when they've got a baby to look after. Different students find different combinations useful to them. And I think one of the things we all noticed during the pandemic was that some students really responded positively to the more reflective pace that, for example, an asynchronous or a text-based environment, a chat window, for example, allows for, where other students and ourselves as teachers, we really missed the responsiveness, the cues, the embodiment, the ability to quickly pick up on when things were going wrong or right and manage your teaching differently that you have in a live embodied environment. So those differences of pace, responsiveness, reflectiveness, we really need to think about what the pedagogical differences are and how they support or don't support different students. We also need to think about how the kind of rules and norms of different spaces might be renegotiated because of the experiences we've had. So Sheila's put up one of her brilliant visuals that we're beginning to pull together from the work we're doing. And this is kind of helping students think about the question, and us, where am I when I am at university? So here I might be in a live lecture theatre, but I might also be told to go and check out some online resources in the VLE. I might be getting sent to a shared group space, perhaps. It's a very big lecture and the lecturer is very sensibly sending off to do a little bit of a group task somewhere and bring it back. Perhaps I'm checking my social media. Oh my God, do you understand this? Where are my mates? Do they get what's going on? Or what were we meant to give in at this next session? I might be quizzing. And this kind of visual can really make much more vivid to people, I think, the kind of combinations of space and place that are going on, the combinations of time use that are going on, and how we might be thinking about managing that complexity. It's not that we've stopped talking about things like learning outcomes and learning activities, but we're bringing in this new layer of thinking around time and place and mode that we actually think might revive and revitalize some of those conversations about learning activities. They certainly help us to think again about the student experience and student well-being. So Sheila, if you just go to the last slide, I think, before we're going to go to questions. We are still working with a big advisory group on some of these issues. So there's every opportunity to influence and change what we're doing, give us feedback, but we're beginning to move towards having some of those high-level principles that we think might be starting points for curriculum and learning design, for certainly for us creating some new materials and guidance and visuals and mapping documents. And the first principle is that bodies are always somewhere. So even though we're online now and we're experienced enough to do a little bit of introductory work, oh, what's the weather like with you? How's your morning been? Actually, we need to think about what responsibilities we have to students and the places they might find themselves in if we ask them to be online. So, for example, in the current cold snap we're having and the cost of living crisis, students might well want to be on campus when they are online. They might actually want to be in a physical, warm, comfortable space with good Wi-Fi that we've provided for them. So their bodily needs are still our responsibility, I think we're saying, even when we're saying to them, well, you're online and we're only interacting with you in this little square bit of you that we can see. However, digital devices mean that presence in the sense of attention and responsiveness can always be somewhere else. So we can't count on having students fully present in any given situation. We can help students to manage their presence and we can support them in managing their distribution of attention, but we have to be aware that that's always going to be a factor in planning a curriculum. How do we direct students' attention? How do we direct their time, their work, their what's important when they have to be present, when it's high value for them to be present, when they can actually do things within a much longer time window and it doesn't matter when they fit it in. And in all of that, our time and attention and theirs are finite. So however we bend and stretch and break time and place through our amazing technologies, there is only so much attention, there's only so much work that we and students can do. And that has to be allocated. So I think the two other things about students is that they expect to have choice, but they need support to make good choices. They expect to know, to have some flexibility now. But how are we helping them to use their skills, to use their motivation, to use their devices, to really make good sense, to make good times and places and pathways for themselves through the curriculum?